International Media TV, television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
I'm Dr. Tommy J. Curry. I'm a professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University and the author of The Man Not. Much of my work is in black male studies. It looks at how black men are victims of sexual violence, rape, castration, mutilation, and violence throughout American history. One of the major problems that we have in the academy is that we don't have real theories to talk about black men and boys. The way that we think about them, the way that we understand them, the way that we claim to empathize and sympathize with their suffering is largely based in caricatures that we have, where we mediate their humanity with the fear that we have of them or what they'll become. A lot of my work is trying to change that. It asks what the world would look like if we understood black males as human beings, where black males had a humanity that they could share with the world, where they weren't understood simply as their corpse. And what we find is that in media, in academic theory, in the world at large, overwhelmingly black men and boys are determined by the fears that other people have of them. So we never get a true understanding of what they've become. We don't understand the pressures they suffer under, and we certainly don't understand their history. So we give accounts of black men during slavery. We'll talk about the slave revolt, but we don't talk about the risks that young black men and boys took trying to become free. What about their vulnerability? We don't talk about white men raping black men. We don't talk about white women raping black men. And this is despite the fact that we have tons of narratives. We have narrative accounts, and even in the autobiography of people like Linda Brent, where we get accounts of black women being raped. But she also tells about Luke, who's chained to her master's bed. She also tells us about the white woman who chose the meanest and most beaten and degraded slave to become the father of her child. Why are these narratives left out of history? What purpose does it serve to have the same accounts of rape and violence in a book and only focus on black women's accounts and suffering and completely ignore black men's? What accounts for that kind of methodological bias? The not seeing of what black men and boys go through, not understanding or even accepting that it's possible for black men to be victims of rape, and that this was a major part, a central part of the system of domination during slavery, Jim Crow, and even today. See, that's what we're trying to get at. Black male studies is trying to reconstruct a history where we have pieces and fragments of what black men and boys were, but nobody's put them together to try to figure out what they are today. So when you look at the accounts of white men eating black male bodies for virility, when you look at the accounts of mistresses, white women, abusing young black boys, taking them for their own pleasure, using them as objects of their own sexual satisfaction, who gives an account of that? What does it mean for the collective consciousness of black men to know that they were victims of rape, to have this kind of sexual violence and sexual vulnerability, but never conceive of it in theory? Most of our theories of black masculinity operate on the fact that black men are rapists, not victims of rape. They look at the construction of the myth of the black rapist, but they never stop to consider the other side. If you think of black men and you mediate their existence based on whether or not they actually commit a crime, that tells you very little about their actual humanity. It tells you very little about what they actually are. The debates that we have in the academy are how violent black men are, not that they're not violent. And that's been socialized into generations of scholars, generations of gender theorists, from black feminists all the way to people who say they specialize specifically in black men. The debate is, how do we mediate the violence that black men have, that they embody, and does that weigh up against their humanity? The work that I'm trying to do asks a fundamentally different question. What if black men simply aren't violent? What if black men are merely the products of the same environments that every other group who's been incarcerated and murdered and dehumanized and impoverished faced? I mean, think about that for a moment. What if we imagine black men to be victims of their environment rather than pathologically and fundamentally flawed? And this seems to me to be a simple intervention, a simple, conclusion, thought, hypothesis, if you will. But that's not how the academy takes it. See, for the academy, this question is so radically different, so radically intervening, that it produces people that have a stark and intuitive reaction to the question of black men's humanity. So this tells us something. It tells us that we've never taken a moment to think of black men beyond the characters that we've been given in theory. So when people like Bell Hooks say that there's a beast inside of black men that patriarchy nourishes, when she says, and We Real Cool, that black men have impulse control problems, right? That they're more violent than ever when she writes this book in 2004. What are we saying about these other groups of human beings? You see, if we accept for a moment that black men have been mutilated, that black men have been dehumanized, that in Jim Crow, like in the case of Jeremiah Reeves, young black boys were being raped by white women and then executed for that victimization. So a white woman could rape a black boy. If he's discovered, if her raping him is discovered, she calls him the rapist and he's executed. What does that mean for the collective trauma of black men in this country? What does it mean to think of black men and boys who've been victims of abuse at the hands of their mothers or their fathers or other people in their communities? Who cries for the young black boy that's been raped and molested by an older woman or someone who's been in charge of his care? Can we even conceptualize black men as victims of rape? What kind of fear do black men and boys have? What fear does a black boy have that he'll never live to be old enough to become a man? Or worse yet, the nightmare that he presents to the American society of actually growing into a black man and what kind of violence that subjects him to. You see, there's a whole world of understanding black men that we haven't even begun to unearth or discover or even look for. Our current theories have made it so that we can't even see the possibility of black men being thought of or interpreted differently. They have to be the nigger. It's like Baldwin says, if a nigger doesn't exist, they'll make a nigger for you. He has to be the caricature of theory because he fits into the world as the deviant. He fits into the world as the rapist. You need him to launch all the gender discourses that have come about since the 1980s. You fear black men, so black men become the terror that your politics like feminism or liberal progressivism fights against. Because of the pessimism and militancy of black men, he's incompatible with your reformism. Because of the sexual mythology of black men, he's the danger and threat to women. Because of the hypermasculinity of young black boys, they have to be ostracized and confined from society. And that's the reason that we have these various rationalizations of what they are and can be. So we see the death of black boys in society, but we don't see their humanity. We run through the streets in outrage when we see a black boy, his dead body, laying there bleeding to death, a victim of another cop's killing or a white vigilante. And we're saying, oh, this is so unjust. We can't believe they would shoot a young black boy. But what do we do to even consider that young black boy's life? Do the same people, do our people, black people, do we value that young black boy and what he'll contribute to our world as a man? Or do we say that, well, he could have been something, but most likely he would have been a criminal, or a rapist, or an abuser of his children or his wife? You see, that's what I mean when I talk about black men being the depository of negativity. All the negative thoughts we have in the world, all the fears we have of each other, someone killing us, someone harming us, someone punching us, somebody abusing us, someone neglecting us, is totalizing how we think of black males. So when those little white children at Columbine were shot, I remember so starkly the news put up pictures of them with flowers and toys and read these poems and these short stories about what their children were going to be and how good they were, how they were going to be doctors and lawyers and nurses. But when black boys are shot, I see no eulogy. I hear no eulogy. I hear no pronouncements of how they were going to be the next genius, the next doctor, find the cure for cancer. And the reason we don't hear that is because society has a problem collectively believing that the humanity of black men has anything to offer civilization. And think about that for a moment. You see, when we have this conversation of black boys, we talk about them as constantly being in crisis. We talk about them not graduating high school. We talk about them going to jail, being murdered. And all of that's true in one aspect. But the other side of that reality is that, well, what do you want to cultivate in them? What do you believe they have the potential to be? Overwhelmingly, the black feminist analysis that has come to define black masculinity constructs black men as threats. It says that if it doesn't buy into their politics, that if it doesn't buy into their ethos, into their way of seeing the world, understanding themselves as dangers and problems, then black men are condemned to be deviants. But look at the theological orientation of that. How is that different than the Christian saying, if you don't believe in my religion, you're going to hell? You see, black men and boys are human beings. Some of them are problems, but some of them are success stories. Some of them can change. Some of them can learn, they can mature, they can develop. They're no different than anyone else in the sense that they can actually become something that they're not. But that potentiality is lost, and it's replaced with the idea that only one sort of politic and one sort of rejection leads black men away from this condemnation that we know as the black male. Everything that you're taught in this society, well, don't believe the black males like the 60s. Don't be a race man. Don't be an athlete. Well, then what are we telling them they can be? What throughout history are we seeing as the positive contribution of black men that's not problematized? And this is to the academics. How do we theorize about race in such a way that black men do not become the problem? Because what I see happening is that we've created an articulation of anti-blackness that we say affects all black people, but somehow that consequence is the same. So even though black men are disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately victims of homicide, disproportionately killed by police officers, disproportionately victims of spousal homicide and intimate partner violence, disproportionately victims of statutory rape and sexual coercion, those kind of vulnerabilities don't define or impress upon the intellectual how black men, the small segment of black men that we call a problem, became that problem. We think that they're pathological. We think that certain groups of black men are born that way because they're born violent. They're born as super predators. And again, we'll express the faux outrage, right, when Hillary Clinton says that there's a group of super predators. But we have no problem making this very same argument on countless blogs and countless articles and throughout the disciplines at large. We have no problem saying that because black men are violent and abuse black women and children more, right, that they are something that we have to deal with. That their patriarchal rage is so dangerous that it may in fact be the case that they have to be incarcerated or killed to protect black women and children. So where's the humanity in that? Where's the humanity in telling a young black boy that you may grow up to be so dangerous that the very people who raised you, the very community that you live in, will have to be fearful of you? And notice what we do there. We extricate all the other explanations of violence from him. We don't say, because you've been a victim of abuse, or child physical abuse, or child sexual assault, that you may one day, that trauma, that hurt, that pain, that lack of compassion and neglect you got from your family, or your mother or father, created something in you that has to be fixed. So we don't believe in rehabilitating black boys. The black male is unfixable. And that's how he's represented in theory. So to have someone imagine a world where black men can learn and change and can be remedied not by fixing some internal problem or some lack that's broken in them, but rather by adjusting the conditions that they're raised in, by exposing that people have biases, that what I call anti-black misandry, which are these cumulative expressions of anti-black male hatred and stereotype, can actually be challenged the same way that you want to challenge misogyny or anti-black misogyny or misogyny against black women and girls. You see, we've neglected to think and study black men. So we've accepted most of the racist caricatures that white theories adjusted to us. We've embraced the idea that black men are hypermasculine, and we've done no research whatsoever in what the word hypermasculinity actually is. It was a term developed by white sociologists to explain a female personality disorder in black men. The idea was that black men were never good fathers. Black men were not patriarchs and couldn't create or sustain nuclear families or households. So when black boys tried to imitate the mother because the black father was gone, right, what ends up happening? Well, he's a black boy. He can't be a black woman. He can't be a woman. So he turns to deviancy. And in turning to deviancy, he becomes hyper-masculine, he becomes criminal, and he rejects everything that's oriented around his mother and the female. So when Monahan makes this argument about black men having low self-esteem, doesn't want to accomplish anything, does not want to participate in society, and they're hyper-masculine, he's drawing that conclusion from decades of white social science, which suggests that black men are effeminate, that they're not real men. And then we accept this term. We don't know anything about the history. We wouldn't dare to read about the connections that racism has to the way we theorize about sex and gender. So we adopt that term. And that term becomes the basis of how we're reading black men through the 1980s and mid-90s. We accept the use of this term by bell hooks. We accept the use of this term by Michelle Wallace. We accept the use of this term by Patricia Hill Collins. And that's not to say that those authors have not made interventions, but the question is, have they gotten black men right? And the answer to that question is an overwhelmingly no. Because black men have not been able to define themselves for themselves. We've become objects of other people's thoughts. We've become the thing you study and the thing you try to cure and remedy. God forbid a black boy actually is proud of being a black man. And this isn't isolated to any of the identity politics that we like to castigate each other for in the academy. Right? So this is not saying that straight black men are more men than gay black men, etc. This is asking a very simple question. When you see a black male body, do you understand that body to be a human being? And that throughout history has taken multiple forms. You see, in the university, in disciplines, we like to play these games. Right? We like to say that, well, you're studying this, so because you're studying this, it means you can't study that. So the minute you talk about black men, oh, you're neglecting black women. You talk about the stereotypes of heterosexual black men, oh, you're homophobic, right? You don't care about gay black men. You talk about gay black men, oh, well, you don't understand queerness, right? You see, it's not the substance or meaning behind our study of black men and boys. It's the question of whether or not you can fit the right black male subject into the theory or conversation at the right time. And the effect of this is that we know absolutely nothing about black men and boys, because every time you try to study them, there's going to be someone there to stop you and say, well, you didn't include X. But where's the book? Where's the field that studies black men and the complexity and multiplicities that every other field has? If you truly believe that you're excluding various types of black males, then why is there not a concept of a plurality of black men besides the black man who's not feminist and macho and the black man who is feminist and progressive? Those are two archetypes. That has nothing to do with the lived experience and realities of black men. What do we do when black men are depressed? What do we do when black men are hurt? Can we hurt black men? Right? I mean, that seems to be a simple and obvious question, but it's a real, can black men hurt? Because what I see throughout our writings, what I see throughout our thinking or our theorizing, is that most people cast black men as invulnerable to pain except when they die at the hand of a bullet. And think about how dehumanized you have to be in the world to suggest that you feel nothing but the death from a bullet. The immediacy of that. There is no pain, there's just death. And you know, we can talk endlessly about the various theories and the various accounts and the various literatures that people have written regarding black males, but I have yet to be impressed with a work that does not reduce them down to death. And I guess perhaps my greatest worry in the work that I do in writing, The Man Not, was how do we escape black men being more than a corpse or a body of rotting flesh. And I diagnose that. I confront death in my work. I think that death is one of the major motivations behind the way black men are treated in this society. And this, of course, builds from social dominance theory and Jim Sedanius's and Felicio Prado's work, as well as others. But there's a certain humbleness and compassion that happens when you have to look death in the eye. You see, like we can theorize endlessly about the number of black men killed, but we can't theorize about one life, and that's worrisome. That we haven't even asked, can we get one black male life right, despite the thousands and thousands of deaths that we constantly point to that signify and hold the place of our supposed outrage or injustice. And that should be a problem of thought. That should be a worry for theory. If we think of theory as the relationship between the fact or materiality in the world and an idea, something that explains coherence and continuity behind the repetition of phenomena that we see, that we observe, then what explains why black men keep dying the way they do? What explains how black men seem to be victims of homicide and lethal violence more than their female counterpart? Why then are black men incarcerated more than black women? Why then do black men have more downward mobility than black women? Why then are black men ostracized from society more than black? What explains the unique position and the continuous and repetitive suffering and dehumanization that black men suffer beyond the question of race? And I don't think we have an answer to that. We can talk about race and gender all day, but I've yet to understand or see, or rather even hear, the kind of compassion for black males that I see or hear from when we're dealing with other subjects and bodies. Do black men suffer depression? If they suffer depression, how do we understand that? If black men are hurt and black men feel that they have no one to speak to, what do we think is going to be produced by that? Now, we could talk about non-deficit models all day, but what's the effect and consequence of racism and anti-black misandry on the soul of black men? See, this is what fascinates me. This is what intrigues me about how we think as academics and scholars, and even activists. If you look at the development of Black Lives Matter, you see that it builds itself on the theories of intersectionality in the academy. So we say things like, well, we don't need to keep focusing and centering black men, even though black men are the greatest victims of police brutality. We don't need black men to lead this movement, even though they're the greatest victims of the kind of violence that you're saying the movement's about. Because we believe in this narrative of history where black men have taken the lead in political movements and organizations, and that was a symbol of patriarchy. We don't ask if the movement was effective. We don't ask if black men were good leaders for the causes that they took up. We don't ask if black men made some of the greatest sacrifices in the history of the world, in knowing that they would be killed for fighting for freedom, but chose to do it anyway. None of that becomes relevant. What becomes relevant is that they're black men. And because they're black men, they should not lead. So the logics of BLM suggest, well, we need to focus on recognition that even though black men are being killed more, they're dying more at the hands of the police, we need to focus on the victims that are not seen. And this is a theory of intersectional invisibility. So we believe that black men getting the spotlight for being shot is a marker and signifier of privilege. That the reason that we spend so much time on black men dying is because we value black men's bodies more. And I want you to think about the silliness and ridiculousness of that position. That black people now become the first people in the history of the world to argue that someone who gets a group that gets killed more is in fact more powerful and privileged, even in death. So the way that we rationalize this is we say we shouldn't talk about the people who are the majority of the victims. We shouldn't talk about the people who lose their lives more. We should talk about the people who are unseen. And anyone that attempts to talk about the hundreds of black men and boys that are killed at the hands of police, those are patriarchs. Those people are sexist because they're crowding out the conversation. They're blocking the recognition of black female bodies and queer bodies and trans bodies. But what happened to the question of who dies? You want to put the 9, the 10, the 12, the 15 black women, the dozen of trans men up against what? What is the debate about? They're all victims. They're all dead. There is no meaning in using their dead bodies for some sort of academic calculus beyond what people want to interpret their lives as. So the Academy anticipates Black Death. It uses Black Death to fuel the discussions it needs to have with white liberals. It doesn't care about the lives of the individuals. Not one paper has been produced about the single life of an individual killed by this kind of violence that we're so outraged about. We use them to stand in for the discursive launch pad. They're the intellectual callus behind conversations that we want to have with the theories we've already formulated. But their lives, what they can be beyond that corpse, is practically irrelevant. And black men are so dehumanized that their corpse just then becomes a number. It's just a statistic. And because there are 200 or 300 black men that are dying, because there's 200 or 300 black male corpses, well, that's too many. So we have to lessen that effect by saying that he takes too much attention away from she. And think about the logic of that. Think about a logic of intersectionality or intersectional visibility that says that those who die the most should not be seen because others more important haven't been seen yet. What view of oppression, what view of more importantly, what view of liberation can grow from that? What view of liberation grows from the fact that I want the camera on these groups of people who are dying? Instead of looking at, well, what's the cumulative effect of killing 300 black males in a community? What is the effect of black women seeing their sons, their husbands, their brothers killed? What is the effect of the black women being killed themselves? That's the issue. The issue is our death. The issue is the connection and the outrage that we should feel for losing black life, not simply counting and enumerating black death. But black boys stand in for that, numerical representation because we can't deal with what they actually are or what they mean. We don't have a concept beyond our fear to describe what their lives are. So we get countless articles and interpretations about black female leadership, black queer leadership, and not one person is asked, has that leadership decreased the number of black people dying? Has the leadership, has divesting black men of leadership in a movement where the primary victims save more of their lives than not? No, because those are real questions. And these aren't political questions, these are intuitive questions. Is the leadership effective? Does the leadership of a group of people who are not the primary victims, which are poor black people, not academics, poor black people, actually effectively describing, intervening, ameliorating the condition of those people? And we're not brave enough to ask that question. We're not brave enough to ask that question because we've become habituated in a way of thinking that utilizes the death of black men and boys to hold places for conversations we want to have with whites. They're not people to us. They're caricatures. And when someone doesn't believe that black men and boys should be caricatures anymore, that black men and boys should be people, that black men and boys have notions of freedom and liberation that can change the way that we think about humanity, that their pessimism, that their death, that their understanding of the homoerotic nature of white supremacy and racism, the eroticism of white women fetishizing their bodies, raping them and then calling them the rapists, the fact that the economy won't let them in, that there's something wrong with capitalism not because of the exploitation, because of the way that it closes off borders, that it makes certain bodies labor and people who process those bodies didn't become rich. And that's not just about the worker and the people who own the means of production. It's about the black man in the prison, the black man and the unemployed, the black man and the criminal. Well, that's too upsetting because it's too many heuristics that go so far beyond what we've been taught to think in Marxism, our feminism, our intersectionality, that we can't process the reality that black men and boys actually expose. And see, that's the power of black male life. Right? It's not an intervention into theory because I thought of something cool, some new category to put with something else. The categories have been ripped apart because the categories cannot explain what black men actually are. Right? And that's very basic. It's basic to the point that if you study black men, you can't believe anymore that America's a democracy. If you study black men, you can't believe capitalism is a way out. If you study black men, your hopes and notions of gender and coalitional progress disappear because no coalition wants the rapist in the coalition with them. So the effect of black men dealing with the specific racist misandry of the world has been that black men have forged radical political potentialities that have not been coalitional the same way that others have, precisely because the people in the coalitions fear and want to kill them. And you know, the irony about this is the irony of the situation, is that we blame black men for not adopting the same kind of politics that black women or white women or other groups can adopt. But then Michelle Wallace made the same claim because she said the minute that black men were working with white women in the civil rights movement and the white women fetishized them and started sleeping with them, that was evidence of black male patriarchy, or what bell hooks call phallocentrism. That they now had the power of the black penis to choose between the white woman and the black woman. What do you expect to happen in coalitional logics? You say that people should work together, should be together, should share interests, and somehow you don't think those people are going to reproduce with each other. You think that the effect of working together, caring for each other's lives, caring for each other's movements, caring and building a future together as a coalition isn't going to lead to a few people dipping in the other side of the racial pool. Because all of history proves that, right? You put people together, somehow they don't end up having sex. It's ridiculous. But the group that becomes demonized for that, of course, is black men. Right? Oh, and then there's the lovely other side of it. Well, you know, when black men start working in coalitions and integrating, according to Michelle Wallace and bell hooks, they wanted to be like white men. Right? So black men suffered centuries of mutilation, abuse, right, cannibalism, right? And their only answer to this was not to hate the white man who raped them, not to hate the white woman who sexually assaulted him and got him murdered as a rapist, but it's to imitate the white man. What other group do we make that claim for? Do we say Jewish men who were victims of the Holocaust, of labor camps, of rape by German SS and capos, wanted nothing more than to be the Nazis? Is that what, do we say that the Armenians wanted to be the Turks? You see, there's no other genocidal logic or murderous regime that we would dare to insult the humanity of by suggesting that their centuries-long battle against their oppressor could be reduced down to one fact, that they just really wanted to be the oppressor. The only group we do that for is black men. And mind you, this is despite the fact that black men are the most unassimilated group in the country. They're most least educated. They certainly spend less time in white spaces compared to their black female counterpart. They're less employed, they're more demonized, they're more criminalized, they're more ostracized. People fear them coming into communities. You read John Dollar's work from the 1930s, he says, look, segregation was set up precisely to keep black men out of white communities because they didn't want him to interact or reproduce with white women, while allowing white men to have access, unfettered access to black women, sexually and culturally. But the product of all our thinking, the product of all our gender theory, right, the product of what we think it means to be a 21st century black intellectual, is that black men want nothing more than to be their oppressor. We take everything from them, all their suffering, all their pain, and we bring them down to imitation. Right? When I wrote The Man Not, I had this long conversation with a few senior colleagues, and they asked me, they were like, "What are you writing the book for? Right? What's going to be the consequence of writing a book that's not just indicting feminism, but indicting the complete history of black thought that interpreted black men as problems, as lesser men, and as something that had to be dealt with?" And I told them, the answer is simple. I believe in black men's humanity. And people think that my thought's radical. They think that, this guy, he's just, what's the term they use, hotep, or, he's this and that. But the biggest difference between me and other black intellectuals, I don't fear black men. I don't fear them. I love black men. I have a compassion for black men. So when I see black men who are rapists or murderers, I don't say they're evil. The first question I ask is, I wonder what happened to them. And that's a radically different orientation than most people have in studying black males. Right? If you believe that black men are going to be born a certain way, then they're disposable. And in many ways, black gender theory, aligns itself with in the white supremacy, which is, black people are problems, especially black men. So since you can't rehabilitate them, you have to kill them. And that's what The Man Not stands against. The Man Not stands against the idea that black male disposability, their murder, dealing with them in terms of lethal violence, is the only way, or is even a way, to deal with problems that black men suffer. As I say in the book, black men are not a product of ontology. The problems of black men are products of sociology. So if there are sociological and societal problems that create what black men undergo and can explain the criminality, can explain the hurt and trauma, can explain the withdrawal, right, from the sociality of the world, if you fix those problems, I believe you fix black men. And this is not a radical thought. Is this not what feminism did for black women? Black feminism did for black women. Right? Is this not what Patricia Hook Collins said? That we are studying black women as objects. We look at them pathologically because we view them from the outside. But when they speak from themselves, they can explain the conditions that give rise to the problems you see in their community. And I say that black men similarly can start with their own experience, what their experience reveals about their conditions, and in listening to black men, we can better understand why those conditions exist and the consequences of those conditions that cause the problems we're interested in, like deviance. You want to stop rape? You want to stop sexual assault? Ask if these black boys have been raped when they were 7 or 9 or 12. You want to stop domestic violence? Deal with alcoholism during pregnancy. Deal with black boys being physically abused in their families, predominantly by their mothers in many cases, by the women that are supposed to take care of them. If you want to solve violence, then start with what creates violence. Don't start with your assumption that the people who commit the violence, because they're black men, have to be fundamentally violent. And this intervention runs across all the theoretical apparatuses that we have. We construct black men as the epitome of evil. So we create a theological orientation to them, where the killing of black men, the erasing of black men, the neglect of black men theoretically becomes honorific precisely because they're evil. And what we're trying to do is reorient that. The Man Not is trying to reorient us to the possibility and the difference, the variety of black men's humanity that simply can't be seen because we're so blinded by our own interests. We're so blinded by the disciplinary narratives and theories that we can't see black men and boys for the human beings that they actually are. And then the radical part about that, because they're black men, is how they've changed that humanity, how they've created new versions of the human, how they just like they create AN1 and jazz and blues, how they've taken the human being and they've created this radical potentiality while maintaining this idea of love and fatherhood and compassion for the whole world. So when white men created the white men's burden, the black man's burden was about helping people who were degraded, who were oppressed, who didn't have hope. Whereas white men and white women joined together to spread their thought about civilization and democracy and all this stuff to the whole world, and crush civilizations and crush cultures. Black men said every culture has a meaning. All right, so Blyden and Du Bois, you know, and the brothers who were working class writing poetry under names like X-Ray and Black Men's Burden Societies were talking about the beauty of difference. And this is in the 1890s, right? But see, we don't value that in black men, right? We don't value that beauty, that tweak, that remix that black men consistently play throughout history. We don't value that some black men like Martin said, no, we're not going to go through violence. And some black men like Stokely said, well, if you're going to let us be killed, then violence is the only way to get to your peace. We don't explain that complexity. We side with Michelle Wallace or Bell Hooks said, well, if you picked up the gun, you wanted to be a patriarch. No, they picked up the gun because they didn't want to become the victims of patriarchs. And we respect that in every other group of people. We respect self-determination. It's written into the UN. We respect the self-determination of groups of people to defend themselves from extermination. But not black men. Right? We don't value that in their history. We don't value them as creating slave revolts, or the Deacons from Defense, or the Black Panthers, or the Black Armed Guard, or even SNCC. And that's not to say that these things are perfect, because nothing in the world exists in perfection, because they're human beings. But it's to say, well, what about the courage it took to do that? What about the cost it took to give your life believing that your children would be free? You know, one of the things that I admire about Du Bois, despite everything that's been written about Du Bois, is him writing children's books. Because Du Bois said, listen, racism's permanent. Racism is never going to be cured in our lifetime. So the key to overcoming racism is to build into the world the hope that our children have about our own people. So him and Augustus Deal, a gay black man, wrote the Brownie books to teach black children to value blackness, so little black boys could believe they can go to school, so little black girls could be whatever they wanted to be. To make little black boys know that you weren't just farmhands, that you can go to school and be a doctor, a professor, etc. And we pay no attention to this. We see no orientation that black men have to a future in which they didn't exist. And we'll talk about kings saying, oh, I may not get there with you, but hell, that's the orientation of every black man throughout history. Because death is so imposing, he knows he's not going to get there with you. So he creates futures through other people. And we've made no theoretical remarks on this case. That the eschatological problem of black maleness confronted with death is to transfer his knowledge to the potentiality of others. But we wouldn't dare call that mothering, right? Because that's too gendered. we don't like naming what black men are, because we like to keep them in this little box, this little confinement of masculinity, and then we problematize that and don't look for any empirical realities around it. So the man not's a way to kind of open to break that box, to open up the possibilities. And it's not a defense of black men's perfection. It's to show you that their problems, right, that their errors are human errors. We don't need perfect black men to exist in the world. We just need black men who are human beings. And I think that one of the ways that this changes and challenges many of our theoretical orientations from black liberalism or all the way to Afro-pessimism, which are on completely different spheres, is that it tries to undergird what we mean by anti-blackness. If we truly believe that anti-blackness is death, then who are the people that are black that are dying the most? Why does violence gravitate towards black male bodies in such a way? And again, this is not to ignore our women who suffer and die along with us, but to ask why the disparity. If blackness is the leveling, is the origin of violence, then what is it about the melanin aspect of that draws violence to them more peculiarly? Right? If we want to be liberals, then what is the problem with a society that claims that it's reformist and democratic in ethos, that it can include other people, But then it segregates black males and young black boys more so than other groups, to the extent that they've been referred to by other people, as in the new Jim Crow, as an underclass. See, what is it that produces the empirical results, right? What is it that shows us that despite the theory, the world keeps pressing back to say that the theory hasn't answered enough? Right? And I think what the Man Not does, what Black Male Studies is doing, you know, why it's speaking to so many black men, is that it tries to give them a new way to think about problems that we don't have answers to, right? It's giving them permission to ask questions that no one's ever thought to ask before. And I was so incredibly humble when Ishmael Reed said that it was like, you know, black men can exhale. You know, it was like reading Richard Wright's Black Boy, because I never intended to write a book that made that kind of statement, but I tried to write a book that allowed other black men to make those kinds of statements. And I think that's the difference. I didn't write The Man Not or try to create a field of black male studies that was about me. I always thought about it as, this is what I see, this is my anger and my frustration and my rage, and that hopefully will open the door for someone much smarter than me to solve this problem. And it's incredibly humbling, not just to be described in that way, but to know that you've achieved that, to know that other black men are connecting with their erasure in theory by inserting themselves and their experience into conversations and discourses about themselves. There is no reason that black men should not be the authors of their own experience and the theories of that experience. It is no reason that black men should remain objects of gender theory or intersectional theory. The central question is, how are black male scholars, black male thinkers, even black women who study black men, going to give us interpretations of black men that do not isolate and reduce them down to deviancy? And insofar as we accomplish that by asking new questions about environment and ecology, of history, of potentiality, then I think we've succeeded in giving some meaning or some explanation of the meaning that black men and boys hold for their own lives. Again, I'm Dr. Tommy J. Curry, a full professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University and author of The Man Not. You can reach me at Twitter at Dr. TJC, or email me tjcurry@tamu.edu.